And the work never ends. See here. Next slide. So the work never ends. In reality, this site, the iteration of the site, has an expiration date. The final school closing announcements will be made, and at that point, I mean, the point is moot, right? The decision has been made, and so you move on. However, this team, I think, has worked so well together and is getting such a great experience out of this that we have sketched out plans for how we would leverage the work that we've done with School Cuts to a much broader, more sustainable site called School Circle that would allow citizens, parents, community members more visual access, more dialogue, more engagement around public school data to increase understanding about the decision making at the district level that affects their local schools. And one surprise element from the This American Life promise that I made at the beginning, was this your first Ruby on Rails project? Yes, it was. Yes, they decided to cut their teeth with Ruby on Rails on this project. So we're still together as a team. We've picked up more people along the way that have been an excellent help on this. But I think it just boils down to those three things. This project, I really believe this project worked because it was created to solve an immediate, real need. It didn't start from the data and find an audience. It started from the audience, and then we found the data. And that we're setting out to create it from a specific perspective with specific questions, and we leveraged this multidisciplinary team, which was fabulous. Questions about School Cuts?
Do you have a sense for how parents are going to view the site?
Yes, actually. We get a lot of feedback about this, and in the strangest way. So we've had people, there's a couple different ways people have been using it. They have used it to go back to their own schools and have conversations about checking the data that CPS has on their school. They've been leaving comments actually on the site about their take on why the data is a specific way. So perhaps they have a new principal, or perhaps they had a big change in the school. We've gotten reports from our people in the field that parents have been printing off, or these community advocates have been printing off the sheets about different schools, and they took them to community hearings to talk to the hearing officers about their specific school. And finally, more recently, which was really fun for me, was receiving Facebook messages and emails from parents of school kids in CPS who want to learn how to do spreadsheets, and a teacher who wants to start a hacking club, a civic hacking club for 7th and 8th graders at a neighborhood school in Chicago, which is really exciting.
Is there any impact that School Circle will have on schools that are not closing, or actually School Cuts on schools that are not closing?
That is a great question. So one of the things that I had talked to, so CPS has been in various levels of interaction with the School Cuts team. Really early on, before School Cuts existed, I was able to talk to a CPS official about what would happen to the schools that were on this original list, but then dropped off. You know, the receiving schools and so on and so forth. I don't know, because we don't have evidence as to how it would impact. But it has been interesting to have conversations with parents. At least I know one that's from a closing school and one that's from a receiving school. The parent at the closing school actually was pretty pleased. She at first was upset that her school was closing, and then went on and looked at the data for the receiving school and was like, this might not be a bad thing after all for me in this particular circumstance with this pair of schools. On the other hand, there has been a number of people saying, wow, I want to make sure that even though my school was on this original list to be closed and we didn't make it onto the final list, that people know the great things that are happening at our school and some of the data that we were able to show, especially sharing the University of Chicago data in this way that you could compare schools, or that it was easy to get conversations around what's working in specific schools.
One thing I would point out, that if you've been, and exactly what you said, but if you've been following the story as well, you'll notice that the number that gets thrown out the most is 54 schools are closing, and that's the largest number, and that is true. But what we also looked at is it's not just the schools that are closing, it's the schools that are getting kids sent to them, it's the schools that are being turned around, it's the schools, and we had this database design set up for when the closing list was released. We said, this school is going to close, and this school is going to receive students. Then the list came out, and it was much messier than that. So here's a typical scenario.
Dr. Courtney.
Yeah, so like one school closes,
Courtney closes.
right, and
No.
then you
Okay, so, no, sorry, Stockton closes, Courtney is the receiving school, but Courtney is relocating to Stockton's building.
They're about to be a part of
And I don't believe that either one of them would retain the original principal, the new principal. So it's just crazy.
So design a database structure for that.
And, you know, it went from 100.
No, I was going to say, in terms of, there was receiving schools and also there's other schools that we found to be affected too, that then ended up on the website, like when they changed the attendance boundaries, there'd be other new attendance boundary schools, we call them, that weren't part of the official receiving school list, but because of the movement of attendance boundaries, future students that would have been going to closing school would now be going to a different school that wasn't part of the official list or talked about at all. So.
Well, that actually brings up a really important point, right? Which has to do with this specific group and the work that we do in Chicago. Not just school cuts, but all of us. That since we didn't start out with a specific data set, since we started out with a series of questions we were trying to answer, there were a lot of times when we were like, wait a minute, this data is missing. And the gap, the absence of data was in some ways just as important as the data that we had in terms of answering questions for parents. And we were able to then ask questions of the people involved in the school closings or go, look up. So what would the answer to that question be in the case of these attendance boundaries changing? Or the most recent one that we field calls from journalists about is the capacity of schools when you have a closing school that goes to a receiving school, and how's that going to affect the capacity of a school? And will the schools actually be able to accommodate all these students they're supposed to be receiving? Which doesn't really get addressed at all right now from the administration.
Will a receiving school receive from more than one closing school?
They can, yeah.
Sometimes.
And one school can be sent, so if one school closes, their students may be sent to a different.
Yeah, and one of the things coming up right now is that's coming out because people are asking the questions about receiving and closing and capacity is, there are a number of schools on this list. I think like close to half the schools on this list have quite a few self-contained classrooms, which is the high need special education students that have cap sizes on their classrooms, sometimes like 7 to 9, sometimes 13. And will those special education students have the same transition plan and go to the same receiving school as the other students at the school? And that's been coming up like, oh, well, maybe not. It was assumed in the messaging and the communications that would be so, but now that people are starting to dig through this and have conversations about, well, wait a minute, there's only like 120 seats available at this school, and there's like 240 kids. How are you?
A lot of that sort of detail, if you're really curious, you can go to the individual hearing officer reports for each school are very interesting. Not only the ones where they didn't agree with the closing, but there are a lot of them where they felt like they had to agree for kind of legal reasons. There's a lot of detail there that argues against the closing. Like they're taking a school that's underutilized and putting them in a school that's now going to have 20% more kids than they should have, not accounting for special education kids, would be better teacher-student ratios. Don't even figure that into the formula. There's one school that's got 4 special programs and special grants from different institutes that's going to disappear, and the kids are going to move and lose music programs, psychological counseling programs, all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of irrational. We only have about a third of the data we really would like to.
Right. Well, but that's interesting too, right? So there's another site that was inspired by school cuts, called that another parent started putting together. That with more of this qualitative data. Oops. Oh well. Oh, sorry. Called Every School is My School. And it was a parent who set out to create these more holistic, qualitative stories for every single school that was affected. I think she was up to like in the 40s right now. I mean, it's a lot of work, and it's not publicly available. I mean, she has to go to the school, do these interviews, figure out the specifics of each of these schools, and then linking back to the school cut site. So going through and like, here's the different programs the school has, here's the different grant relationships that they've created, here's the specific context of this school, because they're not cookie cutter. I mean, a lot of these schools are very, very different. And, you know, it's this cookie cutter formula, this cookie cutter process, and these schools that are extremely different. So
I think that if we do School Circle, we ought to have a lot of this type of information, which will make it people immediately be able to see, well, they're moving people from, they're closing this school, but what do we know about this school? And there's a lot of stuff that we don't know now.
The nice thing I think that they did here was they started using tags, so you can see like these 4 affected schools in West Pullman.
So if you live in a specific community area, you can quickly pull together the stories for just your community. It's been an incredible project. I mean, and it's been really interesting to get the feedback that we have from not just parents, but people who work in the school system, principals, teachers, CPS administrators. A lot of people use the site as a go-to site, even sometimes in lieu of CPS's own site, which is exciting.
I think there was a question.
Yeah, sorry. You pick. Yeah.
I'm just curious, I'm kind of getting a sense of it. If once you started digging into the data, if your opinion of the school closings changed over time, like as you're discovering things, or if it is really just school by school.
For individual, whether they should happen en masse or not?
Yeah, like, I mean, you're obviously all very concerned about it.
It's hard not to, I mean, it's hard not to get this involved in this process and not start to develop an opinion. But it's never, I think, at least personally, if I've developed any opinion at all, it's just a stronger belief that this is really, really complicated. Not that it's positive or negative or it should or shouldn't happen, but this is huge and it's complicated and it's affecting real people, real kids, real lives. Like, that's been my strengthening opinion.
Yeah, and having started the CPS Apples to Apples project way before school closings was even on the radar, and even before the strike, I would say that it's mostly affected my opinion of how good or bad the process around this has been. I still don't know. I would have to walk through each school. I would have to know more, which is interesting to me that Cassandra Cresswell, who's the person that did the Every School is My School site, is going through schools that the Board of Education members and the people who are involved in closings sometimes haven't even walked through the school in the detail that she's going through, which is concerning to me because this is a really big deal that's being made a huge complex decision that affects not just the schools, the communities, property values, crime. I mean, you can't go back and have a do-over on 4th, 5th, and 6th grade if you decide, oh, well, that was a bad idea, we should put the school back.
Do you think CPS knows enough, like has enough data to even know that they're closing their high schools?
So maybe.
Do they care?
I mean, they should.
Well, to your point, I mean, I think my main concern. So I live in Mondale, North Mondale, and that's in the original list. I think they said, well, there's 13 schools in North Mondale, and we want to close 11 of them. So there was a very, kind of real local sense of concern. And I guess for me, it's just like, well, this is a really big decision. And it seems like they're not using a lot of information to make this decision. And in doing the school cuts work, yeah, I still feel like, it's a really big decision, and what they're using to base their decision off of seems very, very slim. And then it begs the bigger question of, even if you bring all this other information to bear, I mean, do you really know what the right, because there's this assumption that this other school is a better school, but you're about to merge different cultures, and certainly the culture of the school has an impact on the quality of the school as well. And yeah, I don't think it's a late.
Well, and the fact that it's a small school might have an effect on the culture of a school, and now you're making a big school out of two small schools. I mean, and that's the whole problem around education data in total.
There's something to be said about whether CPS is enough information or not. I think the best answer we can give to that is, as far as what they said in the messaging, they're considering a lot of factors. And the point here is we don't know because they're not showing their work on a detailed school-by-school level.
Yeah.
So we can't comment whether they did or not because they're not being clear. They're
not being transparent.
They're not being transparent, and that's where the OpenGov civic hardware really comes in.
We know they're closing more schools in low-income, largely African-American neighborhoods.
But we don't know if it's like intentional.
But we don't know if it's intentional or not, but they have not closed their site prep or Lane Tech or any of that.
Well, we know it's not intentional, but we know there's also been a demographic
And we lost
loss of population too.
Yeah, and then there's a systemic, there's the systemic issues around, performance related to income. I mean, there's the whole thing, like the way that they are measuring performance, and this level type issue, or the level metric that they use, and how it doesn't always take into consideration where the kids start and where the kids end. You look at a neighborhood school on the north side, like an Alcott in Lincoln Park, the kids start high, they stay high, and then you look at Bethune, who I think, they start low and end high, but why are they not given credit for that in the level metric? So, I mean, there's all sorts of issues around this. And so, yeah, I would say, I don't know, I personally don't know. I've not been in CPS. I don't think, from what I've seen since August, that their data management, data decision making, cross-department collaboration around data is necessarily very good.
For a lot of questions, there's a lot of us that we keep talking with. There are more questions.
Yes.
Well, so the conversation is already in this vicinity, but I mean, just to maybe ask in a more targeted way, a lot of the anger in the discussion in the wake of school closing announcements is around criticisms that race, that racial considerations cannot be ruled out, or like that there's this proportionate burden. I mean, do you know of anybody who has like kind of formally tackled that, or if you guys have seen enough transparency to indicate that that residential patterns may have that lower utilization may be associated with minority neighborhoods, and that may be an acceptable.
Unrelated to school cuts, I had done this enrollment data since 1999. So I'd imported every year of enrollment for every single facility location since 1999, which is how we got into this whole like, oh my gosh, I want to shoot myself. This is so much data help. And actually, Derek can attest to the fact that I was almost in tears, like, forget it. I've got 2 small children. I'm not going to do this anymore. So I actually cut it by community and went down by community level, and there's no uniform explanation. In some cases, you could see the possibility that it has to do with changes to public housing. In some communities, that lens at that level, you could see that co-location with charter schools or proximity to charter schools might have an effect on the utilization rates dropping in some schools. But there was no you couldn't say in aggregate, City of Chicago, this is why. We have fewer students. We do know that there are, since 1999, the CPS has added around 75 to 80 new schools to their portfolio. So the number of schools has increased since 1999, and this is just kind of like, we've added all these new schools, and so now we're going to take it all back down.
And they plan to add more charter schools in low-income areas, so they're cheaper. Presumably, they don't pay teachers as much.
Yeah, I can't
speak. So the actual number isn't.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a whole other thing that I would like to look into, and I've been looking into on the side. There's a lot of things said about charter schools and their effects on neighborhood schools, and whether they're cheaper, whether they're meant to undermine the unions and stuff. And I personally don't think that we have distinct data that in every case we can just draw within the city of Chicago. I'm not comfortable saying, yes, this is what.
Hey, Rob, you've done some work with demographic data for the city. Do you have some thoughts about the kind of demographic underpinnings of this?
Well, I don't say that this is the kind of data that plays into the hands of the administration, but I've been thinking of it. Chicago lost a hell of a lot of population in the last decade. It lost 200,000 blacks and 218,000 people, period. So probably,
We've lost 33,000 CPS students since 1990.
probably you could identify census tracts where there are community schools that should be closed because there's no population.
Absolutely.
So I haven't seen that done by anyone.
Jim
It's complicated
Spencer
by
at-
some of the demographic problems of the new
Yeah.
grid, of comparability of tract and block
Right.
boundaries over time, but I haven't seen it actually done.
A little bit of it was done by the IFF, which is the institution that underwrites community development financing. So it gives out loans specifically focused on things around housing and charter school development and so on and so forth. So some of that work was done by the IFF. Some of it's been done by CPS administration. We've seen glimpses of it from them, but we haven't, gotten anything in a format that we can do anything with. That's the other challenge of CPS data, all in the portable data format that we know and love. And so early on, I was given access to, I believe his name is Manuel Ariston. He's the Knight Media Fellow that came up with Tabula, where you can go into a PDF and draw a little box and it pulls all the data out in CSV. And I was just like, oh, this is making my life so much easier. Because before then, we had people that were retyping the PDF data like a number of times to make sure that all the errors were caught. So we wouldn't rely on just one transfer over. Different people were transferring the same data over keystroke by keystroke from PDFs so that we could match it up and see, how.
We did some of that with school cuts.
We did some of that with school cuts.
Because,
yes.
so if you were a developer, please don't put data inside an image so we couldn't even scrape it if we wanted to. I think Chad, you have a question.
Yeah, I do. So one of the first things that comes to my mind here is, excuse my ignorance, I don't think it's something that's been discussed, but is there anywhere that you can quantify the cost of a particular school with the teachers involved, the money that goes into that school to run that school, right? And is there a way that can then be taken and you can start to equate, like, this money's gone, where's it going? Because, like, if you're taking it away, hopefully putting it back into the schools somewhere else.
Yes. Yes.
But, like,
and no.
and
so, yes.
So that's the first question. And then the second question is, if you are, or if you do know of that, like, is there something that you're looking to do later that actually speaks about, like, exactly, like, when this money goes away, how does that affect, like, this timeline of a school?
Yes. Yes. Yes and no, yes and yes. So the data for each school is released in budgets every year. We have that data for non-charter schools in detail. Charter schools right now, we don't have the data for charter schools that we have for non-charter schools. There's very little data transparency for charter schools in terms of the detail level of budgets. And the budget format has changed a little bit over the years, which makes it all so easy to. So they have them in PDFs, the school segment reports, and then this year it's actually a little bit more downloadable, but by schools you have to go through. Each school separately. And so the yes part is you have numbers around monies that they have for general education, special education, discretionary spending, that kind of thing. There's also monies that they throw into local school budgets that they say is an allocation from the central office. So you have to back that money out because it's not the money that's actually going to the school. It's money the central office is saying, well, you're benefiting by our wise guidance. So here's the bill for you of this is going to be counted towards your budget, which is called the allocation. So you have to back that out so you know exactly what the money is that each school's getting. There's also money. Some of the North Side schools, or better networked schools with higher income parents, have friends of organizations that money is not transparently reported, it can make a huge difference in a school. Like if for a neighborhood school like Nettlehurst and Lakeview, we're talking like $100,000 of extra money in their budget. Then for charter schools, you can look up their 990s, and there's some information there. So there are ways of getting at that. And then the no thing is the numbers around how much money they're spending on, how much money they would have spent on facilities that they won't spend because the school is no longer being used. There's a lot of discrepancies around what that was based on.
It's interesting because it seems like this would speak to, in some ways, why decisions were made. Or you're maybe not saying why decisions were made, but maybe it makes somebody have to speak. They'd have to speak to it, right?
Yeah, well, that's
exactly
what Apples to Apples and School Cuts was about, was using data to reverse engineer decisions and saying, is this what it is? Is this what it is?
Budget specifically, WBEZ actually dug through some of their estimates, and they kept questioning them, and finally CBS was like, "Oh, yeah, you're right. Our savings estimate was off by $122 million." We overestimated our savings by $124 million, about 20% higher.
But then as they realized they were going to save less and less money, the rationale became utilization, test scores, performance. One thing these people didn't say is that we had good relations with the media. They influenced us, we influenced them, some of our blog posts, some of our data. Even though some of them were a little skeptical that School Cuts was even necessary, afterward they actually saw what we did. They did write stories. And Jeannie was on, what, BEZ, Channel 11,
WBEZ,
Elna was on Fox. We were written up in quite a few news stories.
I mean, the relationship was we would call a reporter and be like, "Hey, have you looked into this?" They're like, "Oh, what does that even mean?" And so, we'd spend like, and this is not to say for all reporters. There's some reporters that were 15 steps ahead of us, and there were some that, I spent 2 hours on the phone with a reporter explaining one thing.
Yeah, I want to say the people at WBZ, awesome. WBZ Education was like 15 steps. They're all over it.
So maybe how journalistic all of this is, right? I mean, it's like, on the one hand, a lot of it, what you're doing is saying, like, how the hell they actually come up with these decisions, and digging to see if they did a good job, and then explaining that. So that's something that journalists only do if the decision is like clearly, if you can say, look, they fucked up. But if it's a debate about like a formula for utilization, that's never gets right. So that's the first.
Yeah.
The second thing you're doing, which is something journalists should be doing and never do, is actually explain shit to people. So your school's getting cut. You might want to know something about your school because it's going to get cut. Like what clear kind of audience is there, right? And this is and it's just incredible. So has there been any response from journalists being like, "Wow, how did you do this? Can we do this too?" Or
yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. I mean, definitely people are interested in wanting to. Everything from knowing what more they could look into. I mean, we're very clear with a number of journalists that we are not journalists, and we don't intend to be journalists or replace them in any way. That our goal was to create dialogue and to help parents feel more empowered through understanding this data. But on the other hand, it has been really interesting with the fact that so many of these journalistic entities have had such deep cuts to staff, especially around education reporting, that it's been a very nice interplay between journalists and the School Cuts team, where they say, do you have anything on this, or have you seen anything on this? Or we say, we can't address this in School Cuts because this is. I'm trying to think of an example.
Well, I think the one tweet that kind of captures it all was Becky B from WC said, "Forget spreadsheets, man. I'm just going to look up what I need on
School Cuts." Right.
Yeah, and if you have a question, we don't have all the information, and there's definitely data here that you can question editorial choices and all that. But yeah, it's easier to look through this than merge this spreadsheet with that and see whether. They released the closing list in the PDF.
Yeah.
What's
many of the data that's here is actually available on CPS. It's just you have to look for it.
So, and it's a PDF attachment somewhere 8 levels down.
I'm the most radical person on this team. I had a conversation with a guy who's probably the preeminent expert on school data, in Chicago.
Who's that?
I can't tell you who it is. And he basically said, Ron gave B3 the list of schools he wanted to close and he wants to replace them with charters, and this is what they're doing, and the data doesn't have much to do with it. And now we're letting people actually see, does the data have anything to do with it?
And I would say that also knowing a lot of people in CPS that there's not universal evidence.
Right, but I'm just saying, I mean.
That's why we have the multidisciplinary team where we're like,
Conversations we're gonna,
yeah.
It's also funny, so why don't we make this more formal on our pizza? But thank you so much, and I want to say it's personally that like this is the most mature and important project that's come out of Open Garden in Chicago, and like thanks so much for playing around. It's really good.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks for having us.